Hello, my name is Ian, and today we're talking about Anthony Buccitelli's Ethnic Symbols, Intertextuality, and Indexed Memory. This is a chapter from Anthony's wonderful book, City of Neighborhoods, the subtitle of which is Memory, Folklore, and Ethnic Place in Boston. Basically, it is an examination of the concept of the ethnic neighborhood. What makes a neighborhood ethnic beyond the simple history, of sort of accreted inhabitants. First of all, it explores the very concept of what we mean by ethnicity and the slipperiness of that term. Are we talking about place? Are we talking about place of origin? Are we talking about genetic heritage? Often ethnicity is something that is defined in large part in contrast with another, and that other is often a group in power. It's that in many ways you could make an argument that sometimes ethnicity is defined by the other. And it's like, I am this person. It's like, well, no, you are actually that person. And then, a neighborhood can become ethnic in part because people move there and more people move there and they create a community, and that's all very well and good and positive. And we can see that in a number of different places, and he provides examples of that in Boston. And we can see it in Cape Breton. We can see it basically everywhere. But then there is the flip side. There is, first of all, the issue of why the original ethnic groups, again using the problematic terms, might have settled there. They might have settled there in part because of being economically edged out from other neighborhoods. And so they become these little enclaves where meaning is made, but meaning is made in part because they do not necessarily have access to the broad cultural landscape. They simply don't have economic, and often not simply the matter of an ethnic community being economically disadvantaged, but systemically or systematically shut out from particular other neighborhoods, for potentially more desirable neighborhoods. And then the flip side of that is when these again, using the term loosely, these ethnic neighborhoods become entrenched and territory is claimed, and they themselves also become exclusionary practices. And one can do that. You can see in the history of the United States, you can see in the history of Canada, you can see in the history of everywhere where often it is a result of, that initial push is often a result of basically people outside of the realms of privilege being funneled into particular areas proximate to working class, proximate to things like factories. I think of the neighborhood here in Sydney, the Whitney Pier neighborhood. It was our multicultural neighborhood in part because it was so close to the steel plant. And then you have the notions of sort of environmental racism, where these neighborhoods are often in more dangerous areas in terms of proximity to pollution, proximity to heavy metals, proximity to a toxic environment. And then, as I said, one of the things that sustains these neighborhoods when that power is coming from within, it's like, no, we might not have chosen this place, but now that we have this place, we are reaffirming it, is not necessarily done through the instruments of power and law. It's done through the instruments of folklore, really. It's done through the instruments of making a claim symbolically, by claiming the space through performance and through material culture. Performance in terms of things like parades. That's one of the things about a parade is it is a triumph through the public sphere. It is a temporary reclaiming of what is, in theory, neutral space, and momentarily defining it in one particular way. And by defining it in one particular way, perhaps only on one particular day of the year, that meaning can be extended throughout the years, and then it's just sort of reinforced. Or we do it through material culture, and here he's interested in material culture, and particularly the issue of the shamrock. He talks about the flag of the People's Republic of China later on in the chapter, but he starts with the shamrock because the shamrock was introduced at a housing meeting as a problematic symbol, in that it could potentially have connotations in a way similar, and it was put analogously to things like Confederate flags of the American South. And there was within the highly Irish city of Boston, and by saying that I'm already laying an ethnicity over a place, but particularly the strong Irish neighborhoods in Boston, that was seen as some kind of affront, because the idea of the shamrock as anything other than a potentially neutral, I mean, clearly an Irish one, but its Irishness is a neutral value. It just identifies, it's a source of pride. And then once you have the issue of pride, then you have the whole discourse about what pride means at any given moment. But the shamrock becomes this this question about whether it is simply a way of marking Irish descent, or whether dissent is in. Sorry, there's a homophone aspect, not dissent, D-I-S-S, but dissent is in descendancy. It's just simply, this is just part of our heritage in that sort of very kind of neutral way. The other issue is that it's often, associated with particular people. It isn't even my heritage, but it is the heritage of someone else. And so when I think of a shamrock, I think of this person, or this marker of place, that it is, we use it because Boston is an Irish town. So already making that claim. And then one of the problems, or one of the issues, is that the shamrock has also been used in a way that is expressly more than simply making a statement of Irishness. It is making a statement of Irishness against or in contrast to another group. So the way that it had been used in things like disruption, protesting the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, in a St. Patrick's Day parade, and it was used in a very violent outburst with very violent epithets and language, and the shamrock became associated with it. Vandalism in an African American home, where the shamrock and symbols of the Ku Klux Klan were used in the same moment, and in a way, simply through the act of juxtaposition, you can make the argument that an intent is being made, that more meaning is being accreted in that shamrock. So does that shamrock ever really, maybe you could just say at least within the confines of Boston, but does it ever really lose that legacy of that sort of employ within the realm of hate speech, within the realm of it being used as an identity marker that is intentionally antagonistic and directed towards and against other races? So it becomes a symbol that is more latent. So then it becomes, will it ever retract to neutrality? Does it ever retract back to that? So you can make an argument that there are people who are using it in this rather neutral way, but someone else will see it. Because symbols are polyvalent. Symbols have multiple meanings. It is precisely that polyvalence that makes symbols both so important and so slippery. And when you see it being used in this way, how do you address it? So he talks about these 4 strains of meaning, where the critics say that the shamrock represents this, not simply this matter of Irish pride. People don't really have an issue with people, with others being okay and celebratory about their history and their ethnogenetic heritage and so on, save to the point where that is coming at the defiant expense of another group. And so it's that's where it's a clash, where it becomes this issue of supremacy or this issue of making a claim. And then then the supporters of it will talk about it in terms of within the long history of tension between the Irish and the Yankee. And so it is a system of defiance, but it is a symbol of defiance in some ways, but that symbol of defiance comes within this long history of oppression. So it is a pride marker in the way that other symbols of other marginalized groups have these markers to remind themselves that they are, that at least in their history and perhaps ongoingly, they are in this system of oppression. Because ethnicity tends to be defined many times within power structures and within the histories of those power structures being imbalanced. I mean, we can perhaps, in our day-to-day, we can choose to operate with the idea and reaffirm and confirm and avow to operate within the idea that ethnicity is simply a category of being, of rich history, something to celebrate. Yet if we forget that that hasn't always been the case, and that within the very recent history, and of course among many people who aren't us cool people, it has not necessarily been this wonderful moment of enlightened and brotherhood of man. If we forget that, we are erasing a certain amount of history. So even if we choose to, and hopefully we do, choose to render ethnicity as a category of celebration and not a category of otherness, we need to remember that it has historically been an othering category, and we can't necessarily forget that. And so this idea of whether it's just strictly personal, whether it is defiance in terms of pushing against a privileged power and not necessarily a similarly or even more disadvantaged or lacking in privileged group, or whether it is just this sense of continuity with the past. So the Shamrock is, I mean, you know what the Shamrock is. It has this long history of association with Ireland, this association with St. Patrick. The idea is that St. Patrick used it to explain the Trinity, the one in three, the God in three persons. And, you know, that's where the folklorists pricks up their ears because they like legends. And I don't know if you know that the word legend originally comes from writing about the saints, these stories that help to put the saints in some kind of context, that they're not necessarily, I mean, they are shared, but they put this historical figure, this extraordinary historical figure within a particular context. So legend has that association, which is weird because legend is an oral formulation, is an oral genre, and yet it comes from legende, to be something that is written. That's a fun fact. Don't you love fun facts? There we go. So it was first used by Protestants more than it was by, and then sort of the generic Irish, and it was only in the 19th century when it took on this connotation, at least in the United States, of Irish Catholic in particular, and that is sort of probably its strongest connotation, and like the invention of Irishness in the United States as this category. The Irish are sometimes described as being the first ethnic group. They were the first group that in America. They arrived and they were marked as distinct from the privileged population. In part because, for the most part, even though there was Irish Gaelic speakers as well, they were, in some ways, they were the closest to the Anglo-Protestant community in terms of, so they weren't marked in the same way that Germans were and other immigrant populations in the 19th century. But they were at the same time very, very othered, and they went through histories of genuine oppression. But the history of the genuine oppression is something that also enters into the folklore. And that's one of the things that he raises, this history of the no Irish need apply, something that was invoked by a city councillor who was rejecting the idea of this being, of the Shamrock being a potentially a potentially offensive, or at least a potentially non-neutral symbol. And he invoked particularly "No Irish Need Apply." And "No Irish Need Apply" is has a long history within the United States of being basically a touchstone. He uses the word kernel narrative, which comes from, or the term kernel narrative, which comes from Susan Kalchik. And Susan Kalchik basically made this argument that within in-groups, it's a wonderful idea. And other people have used it, but it sort of starts with Susan Kalchik, that within in-groups there are shared narratives, shared stories that are so part of that group's sense of self that it rarely, if ever, needs to actually be retold. It could just be referred to by just like a passing reference, and it invokes that shared history, at least that shared repertoire, and often that shared history. And not only does it invoke it, it puts the next situation into context of this is how it operates. So it almost functions in the same way of a proverb, in that it orients the immediate situation by invoking not an adage but a history. Sometimes a fiction, but often the shared sense of history. Other people will use the word metonym, the idea that the story can basically be referenced by just a passing thing. So the "No Irish Need Apply" is this cultural narrative about how over the long 19th century, as the Irish entered into the United States, there was a constant, employment was almost impossible because of the indwelt racism, for lack of a better word, towards the Irish. And that "No Irish Need Apply," or I think Johnny Rotten's autobiography is "No Blacks, No Dogs, No Irish," using the same basic sort of formulation, that they were the Irish were an unwelcome presence. One of the things about narratives about hardship is the implied coda of "nevertheless we are still here." Nevertheless we have emerged from this. But we can always go back to that joint history of oppression, and it can be invoked, and it immediately situates the Irish within this history of historic disadvantage, and hence that issue of pride being because we weren't allowed to be wholly American. We were always vilified in this way, and so we emerge. And it's a really interesting invocation. He talks about these two moments where the shamrock was used in this same sort of sense, and one was at the house in the Shamrock House, the Mayor Curley's house in Jamaica Plains. When this house was built, and it had he was the mayor. And he was only the fourth Catholic mayor in Boston. And in this predominantly Protestant neighborhood, his house, he had all the shutters with shamrocks in them. And it was deliberately this defiant moment. Anthony quotes Jack Santino. "In such a context, symbols are not merely displayed or enacted, they are used to assert territoriality and identity, to welcome or warn, and frequently to offend. It is often observed that flags are more likely to be displayed in areas where there are significant numbers of a population who will be offended by their presence." So Curley was incredibly defiant by covering his house in these symbols. And so suggesting that it is not neutral, it is directed, and it is not directed towards the Irish, it is directed specifically towards the non-Irish. The Yankee aristocracy, perhaps, the privileged population, but it is So its neutrality, even 100 years ago, was already a little bit on the side. The second use was how it was used by organizations that were opposed to busing, where busing was the consequence of the integration of school boards in the United States, and the use of busing African American students into schools that were basically, the schools were better serviced because they were in neighborhoods with a better tax bracket, and therefore they had, because the schooling system is based largely, the strength of an individual school is largely based on the wealth of the neighborhood. Historically disadvantaged neighborhoods had historically disadvantaged schools, and so that sort of defied the principle of equality, that is a fundamental good. And the answer to that was, instead of subsidizing schools equally, it was bringing people into these historically better serviced schools, and then that brought about a whole counter protest, and the counter protest was inevitably about race. And so because it was inevitably about anti-African American presence within historically white neighborhoods. And the SHAMROCK was used frequently in the organizations that were against it. Was the ROAR, ROAR, the Restore Our Alienated Rights, this anti-busing unit. So yes, it's quite this. It has this problematic history. So whether it's Yankee authority, resistance to that. And again, you might be siding with the issue of Yankee authority, I can see that. Or whether it is then consolidating against a group that is as, if not more, historically disadvantaged than you. That is problematic. And one of the things about the ethnic tensions that exist in Boston and exist in other cities as well, but Buccitelli's case is Boston, is that the irony of groups being set against each other and being in remarkable tension with each other, when what they ought to be is that they have far more in common with each other in terms of their history of being historically disadvantaged, in part because they frame things as issues of ethnicity and race, when often it's really fundamentally a matter of class. And the privileged classes that are also defined in large part by ethnicity have the advantage, and yet two similarly disadvantaged groups see themselves in opposition because they are of different ethnic heritages, as opposed to seeing themselves allied and against that privileged class. So yeah, it's a particularly interesting thing. And one of the things I really like about Buccitelli's argument is that he introduced me to this concept. In this chapter, he introduced me to this concept of enhanced whiteness. And one of the things that Irishness does is that Irishness, because of the no Irish need apply narrative, because of the both historically grounded, but then subsequently the levels of folklore that are put upon it. Remember, folklore not being falsehood, but folklore being accreted narratives that help to continually define, often in terms of contrast with another group, define a sense of groupness. And there's a mutual mediating relationship between a group's lore and a group's sense of self and a group's sense of identity, in that we are to be of this group is to accept this lore is to be of this group, and sort of this sort of idea. And the idea of enhanced whiteness is really kind of fascinating, because Irishness then becomes this category that gives you all the advantages of being a disadvantaged group, all the sort of righteous furor of being a marginalized population, while simultaneously having the advantages of being an embodied being with white skin in a fundamentally racist culture. So, and so it is a way, and ironically, it becomes a way of celebrating whiteness, and embracing whiteness without the icky stuff of white nationalism, because it's like, no, this is about Irishness, and so it has this sort of odd thing, odd nuance to it. This notion, and he's quoting Negra and Egan and Casey, but so enriched whiteness allows white people to claim both the status of whiteness and the status of otherness simultaneously. It recalls their oppression while continuing to enjoy the benefits of white privilege, thus appropriating the suffering of people of color for their own psychic ease, and the odd alliance, or at least alliance through symbol, that will sometimes occur between the Irish and the African American community. Just think of things like, House of Pain might be one of the best examples of it, where they are using, I don't know if appropriating is the right word, because I think that might be a whole other discussion, but they are using a historically African American genre of hip hop and to explain a kind of defiant American Irishness. So shamrocks and shenanigans and jump around and all that sort of thing. And then finally, they provide both a cultural base for textured white racial nationalism and a convenient smokescreen for the public celebration of whiteness. So if you think of something like a St. Patrick's Day parade, it is a whiteness parade, but it has the benefit of this historical narrative of defiance. And so again, it kind of glosses over some of the ickiness that a whiteness parade might have. And I said one of the things I like about this chapter is that it introduced me to this concept of enhanced whiteness, because that's something that I see where I am in Cape Breton with Scottishness, and that it forms this kind of, especially since Cape Breton defines itself so much in terms of its Scottishness, it provides this ongoing narrative of defiance because of both the historic, but very much the folkloric as well, narratives of systemic and systematic oppression by an Anglo-Protestant, or Protestant might be something because of the both Catholic and Protestant Scots, might be a bit more of a gloss, but certainly like the dominant Anglo community, while simultaneously being a celebration of whiteness, and therefore, other forms of exclusion. Because one of the things, when you're talking about a city, a city is a kind of a dynamic place where you have this sense of neighborhood, you have this sense of territoriality, but it's a territoriality in a very artificial, or recognized artificial grid, because it is like this human-made structure of buildings and streets. But it's not that much different from sort of the basic nationalism of that a landscape and the people who inhabit that landscape are naturally tied to each other, and they're naturally tied to each other through narratives that they share about place, and but that's okay until it becomes an exclusionary principle, until it becomes the people who do not fit into the folklore of this place, do not fit into the oral history, do not fit into the sort of the shared dynamic, are outlanders. And that's when it becomes icky. I'm using the word icky again, which is a very soft word, but it's kind of what's going on here. So, as I said, he does touch on this last moment where an interesting thing happened with the rising of the flag of the People's Republic of China at a Chinese cultural center, and the pushback against it. Because now you have something that is not, it is less of a polyvalent symbol than a shamrock, because it is also clearly the official representative symbol of a country, the People's Republic of China, a country with a fraught history with the United States, a history in terms of its in terms of its allyship and support of people who were enemies in wars, as in the North Koreans and the North Vietnamese. And so veterans had an issue, despite the fact that post-Nixon, and certainly in the past 20, 30 years, the relations with China have normalized, and immigration is a more regular thing. And there's still that, but wait, you have this flag that represents not simply this place, but communism, and a communist state in this neighborhood, in Quincy, in the city of presidents, and that is potentially problematic. And then other people say, well, no, this is not about China. This is about the Chinese. This is a ethnic thing. This is not a national or political entity thing. This is not representing the government of China. This is representing the people of China. And then you have this other group just saying, but many of the Chinese population arrived here in two different waves. One was prior to 1949, prior to the founding of the People's Republic of China anyway. And yes, red had been a color that represented the Chinese long before it also represented the Communist Party. But this is still the party this is still the flag of the Communist Party. And so this flag doesn't mean anything to us because we trace our Chineseness and our Chinese Americanness prior to the creation of this state. And then a second group saying, this was the country that we fled from. We are post-1949, but we came here prior to normalization, but we escaped this place, and that is our history. So when is a flag, going back to that quote from Santino, when is a flag a marker of place? When is it defiant? And who interprets what a flag is? And how does simply one flag in a neighborhood become interpreted as not a statement, but a challenge, an aggressive statement, a defiant statement? And it's really kind of fascinating because they're all about claims to the urban. As I mentioned, we talk about these things within the nationalist context of the owner of landscape and so on, and the weird relationship that folklore has with romantic nationalism and Herder's idea of romantic nationalism. These narratives of place that give proof to a people of their natural claim to this place at the exclusion of someone else, which is it's a sticky wicket, if you will allow the understatement. And then the urban space is very different. It's parallel, but it's very different because it's sort of different lived experience, because it's working within the system of contemporary American capitalism, the issue of property, the issue of what is owned, how does one define community when one has actually very little control over how one's community is constructed. And we're not, for the most part, in neighborhoods, we're not building our own houses. We don't have that sort of vernacularness. We have a system of housing that we enter into, and we more or less recreate through symbol. There's interesting. I'm on a tangent right now, but there's an interesting parallel in terms of sort of company housing, because so much of the discussion of the contemporary urban setting are these neighborhoods that are often constructed quickly. They're often constructed sometimes with the impetus of being factory housing and housing that's proximate to industry and so on, but also suburban neighborhoods and the like. But how does one impose one's sense of self, either individually or collectively, on a place? How do you turn space into place? How do you turn the objective landscape into a subjective landscape, a landscape that inherently has a story and a claim to it? Everything from as neutral as yard art to as defiant as painting the outside of your house in shamrocks and bold colors, to an entire neighborhood collaborating and making a claim of this space. It's really kind of fascinating. Again, I waffled. It's a wonderful chapter. It's a wonderful book. I highly recommend the book in its entirety. But, you know, the nature of the beast, I had to pick a chapter, and this is the one I chose. So, I think I am done. This is, so as ever, I am your best friend, your number one pal, chum supreme, Ian, and we have been talking about Anthony Buccitelli's Ethnic Symbols, Intertextuality, and Indexed Memory. As ever, my friends, I wish you nothing but the best, and be well. Bye-bye.